Hi, thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. Trigger warnings for suicide, fire, of general violence. Indeed, I'm Adam. I'm presenting from London, Ontario, in Canada. Thank you so much to Tom and Will for organizing the seminar and everybody else who has had a part, including, of course, all the brilliant presenters without whom this would not be happening. I'll be presenting on the pyre of Denethor from suicide on the page to manslaughter on the screen. Sorry, on the screen. The argument I'm going to be developing in this presentation is that in the book, Gandalf would not kill Denethor as he does in the movie, and it is actually quite important that he doesn't. The fact that he does in the movie speaks to a certain disregard for the broader religious implications of Tolkien's subcreation. Tolkien has written in several instances, especially in his letters, that the major theme of his work is death and immortality. Therefore, I think looking at the deaths of characters in The Lord of the Rings is of particular note, and the suicide in this case is no coincidence. So first, I'm going to start by setting up the scene in the book, and then we're actually going to be looking at the scene in Peter Jackson's adaptation, if Eru blesses me with strong enough bandwidth. Um, but in the book, the scene starts from the perspective of Pippin following Gandalf. And as Gandalf arrives at the House of the Dead, he sees that some of the guards have been slain, and upon seeing that, he says that this is work of the enemy because Sauron loves it when friend is at war with friend. They then erupt into the House of the Dead, where Denethor, who's very far away from the pyre, is disarmed by Gandalf by the use of magic. It is then Gandalf who goes to the pyre with Denethor to retrieve Faramir. At this point, Faramir stirs, and Denethor, quote, started as one waking from a trance, end quote, and seeing that Faramir is alive, wants to go to Faramir, but Gandalf stops him, saying that Faramir needs urgent healing and that Denethor himself needs to get out of his own darkness before he can help his son. There follows a long discussion on hope and despair, and if there is any hope of defeating evil in Middle-earth. At which point Gandalf tells Denethor, quote, "Authority is not given to you, steward of Gondor, to order the hour of your death," end quote. Which enrages Denethor, and he reveals that he has a Palantir and that he has been using it to observe the world, specifically observing the rise of the power of Mordor, and that he has also noticed that that Gandalf is bringing Aragorn to Minas Tirith, and Denethor views that as a personal threat to his rule. He says, quote, "I will not bow to such a one, last of a rugged house, long bereft of lordship and dignity," end quote. And then the conversation escalates. Denethor enrages again, succumbs to madness, and quote, "Before Gandalf could hinder him," end quote, Denethor sets himself ablaze and dies. At least that is how things go in the book. Now we're going to take a look at the scene in the movie. So again, trigger warning for suicide and death by fire. I'm going to play this scene without sound because I hope to talk over it. Again, I'm really interested in the bandwidth here. We'll see if this works. So the scene in the movie starts a lot more dramatically with Denethor pouring oil upon himself and on Faramir as he is about to set them aflame. In the book, the scene starts with Merry and Pippin coming into the scene where there is actually a fair bit of violence happening because there is infighting among the guards, one of them loyal to Faramir and the rest loyal to Denethor. The fire of the scene here, of course, heightens immensely the suspense. The music is very dramatic, although I cut the sound here. That the flames heighten the sense of drama of the scene and the action. Um, Again, a very dynamic shot. Gandalf coming in. Here, the speech Denethor gives echoes what happens in the book. Basically, he says that although Gondor might find victory in the field for one day, against the power that rises in the east, there can be no victory, arguing for despair against Gandalf's view of hope. But the whole discussion is shortened to this very quick moment. It is worth noting that in the book, Faramir is never on the pyre while it is alight. Here in the movie, we see Denethor gets punted off the pyre by Gandalf. At this point, it is Pippin who frees Faramir from the flames. And once Faramir is rolled out, it is worth noting that both Denethor and Faramir at this point are no longer in mortal peril. Um, Denethor echoes his line from the book, "You will not take my son from me," except he directs it at Pippin instead of Gandalf. Gandalf analyzes the scene and decides the only solution is to have Shadowfax kick Denethor back onto the pyre, where Denethor awakens, seeing that Faramir is alive, says the name of his son, and then dies. And we do not need to see, but Denethor at this point dies. So a few differences I'd like to point out. Firstly, in terms of the order of events, a detail that I think matters greatly is that in the book, Denethor realizes that Faramir is alive before committing suicide and setting himself for the flame. Whereas in the movie, Denethor only realizes fully that Faramir is alive as he is dying. In the book, there is a very long discussion about hope and despair, which is completely lost in the film. And also in the movie, there is no presence of the Palantir, which I will elaborate on why that matters later. One other big difference is in the book, Gandalf is fairly passive. He is mostly talking to Denethor, and before he could hinder him, Denethor commits suicide. Whereas in the movie, Gandalf is the one who kicks Denethor back on the pyre with the help of Shadowfax, which again I think matters greatly. So my thesis is on adaptation. My PhD thesis is on adaptation of fantasy novels to movies and TV shows. This is not to discuss whether the book or the movie is better. This isn't simply an argument that, oh, if you change something in the movie, you're not being true to the original work. Adaptation is a very complex process, which cannot simply be a replication of a book to a new medium. Necessarily, there are going to be some changes. But what I'm doing in my PhD, or at least I'm hoping to do, is to show that these necessary changes create a conversation and hopefully a better understanding of both the book and the movie. Linda Hutcheon, in her book A Theory of Adaptation, talks about the idea that your mind oscillates if you experience the work as an adaptation, meaning as you watch the movie, you are thinking about the book, and as you read the book, you are thinking about the movie. And as I was doing that for the scene, I asked myself two questions, which is, why does Denethor commit suicide? And would Book Gandalf kill Denethor the same way he does in the movie? But to answer this, first we must understand who is Gandalf. We have had already quite a few presentations on this today, but briefly, Gandalf presents himself as, quote, a servant of the secret fire, end quote, in the Fellowship of the Rings. And in The Return of the King, he says to Denethor quite cheekily, actually, quote, I also am a steward, don't you know? End quote. But where Denethor is a steward of Gondor, Gandalf is a steward for the entirety of Middle-earth, sent here by Eru Ilúvatar, the supreme being, the wielder of the secret fire. Gandalf, of course, is one of the wizards, one of the Istari. Tolkien in the Silmarillion writes that the wizards were sent, quote, to contest the power of Sauron if he should arise again, and to move elves and men and all living things of goodwill to valiant deeds, end quote. And in his letters, he further elaborates, quote, they should do what they were primarily sent for, to train, advise, instruct, arouse the hearts and minds of those threatened by Sauron to resistance with their own strengths, and not just to do the job for them, end quote. So Gandalf is one of the Maiar, one of the Istari, and it is worth noting that in The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf is the only Maiar who has remained true to his mission. Other Maiar present are Saruman, who's also one of the Istari, who's of course fallen from the corruption of the ring and desiring it for himself. Sauron, the most emblematic example of evil in Middle-earth at this time, is a fallen Maiar. The Balrogs themselves are fallen Maiar. The only one who isn't completely fallen yet, apart from Gandalf, is Radagast. But Radagast is completely disinterested in men and elves and seems focused on the flora and fauna of Middle-earth. And so possibly has uh, strayed from his mission, which speaks to the fact that Gandalf himself is at quite some risk of falling should he act wrongly. And the books and the movie both emphasize this in the case of the ring, but I think this would also work in the case of Denethor's death. The reason why killing Denethor would be a big problem is because of the whole concepts of fate and free will. In the book, Gandalf does not physically stop Denethor from committing suicide. Tolkien writes that it's because Gandalf doesn't have the time, but as Holly just described, Denethor actually does a fair bit as he's committing suicide. He breaks his staff, he does quite a few things. So I think Gandalf would have had the time, but Tolkien writes differently. Um, in The Return of the King, quote, "You shall not rob your son of his choice while his death is still in doubt," is what Gandalf says to Denethor to tell him why he cannot kill Faramir at the very least, because it is robbing him of his free will. The movie portrays Gandalf as a far more active fighter. In the book, his direct involvement in fights is quite limited. He does fight the Balrog, he does fight the Nazgul several times, but he never commits manslaughter in the book. Gandalf actively killing Denethor could be seen as an act that pushes Gandalf on the road to tyranny because he is robbing Denethor of free will in this moment. The only people that Gandalf is supposed to fight are the enemy, which leads us to wonder, is Denethor the enemy? He is certainly very prideful, very arrogant, very self-centered, but I don't think it rises to the point of him being the enemy. In the book, as Gondor is besieged, so Minas Tirith is besieged, several soldiers come to him for his orders on how to fight the orcs. And he says, quote, "I will not come. I must stay beside my son. He might still speak before the end," end quotes. And further, as the orcs breach the lower gates and set fire to Minas Tirith, uh, Denethor continues, quote, "Better to burn sooner than late, but burn we must. Go back to your bonfire," end quote. He says to a soldier who then flees, uh, based on the fact that their general is refusing to command. In the movie, however, when Faramir is brought back to Minas Tirith mortally wounded and Denethor thinks my line has ended, uh, he sees the vastness of the army of Mordor and, shocked by it, suddenly screams across a parapet, quote, "Abandon your posts, flee, flee for your lives," to his entire army. So I think there is a difference between Denethor's passive negligence of duty in the book to Denethor's very active orders to just stop fighting and abandon their post to his army in the movie. One of the things that is most different, I think, between the book and the movie is the absence of the Palantir of Minas Tirith. In the book, shortly after Faramir dies, uh, Denethor goes to his tower where he uses the Palantir to observe the world. And a little while later, he tells Pippin, quote, "The fool's hope has failed. The enemy has found it, and now his power waxes." This is a bit of an enigmatic line, but thanks to the work of scholars like Tom Shippey, we know that the day Faramir is brought back to Minas Tirith is also the day that Frodo is captured in Cirith Ungol. So as Faramir is dying, Denethor looks through the Palantir and sees a hobbit in Mordor being captured by orcs. He correctly assumes that this means the ring bearer has been captured. What he does not know is that this time, luckily, Sam has the ring. So he has, again, some information, but he misinterprets it, thinking that this means the doom of all of mankind. Shortly after Denethor's death, Gandalf explains to Pippin, this is a longer passage, bear with me. Quote, "In the days of his wisdom, Denethor would not presume to use the Palantir to challenge Sauron, knowing the limits of his own strength. But his wisdom failed, and I fear that as the peril of his realm grew, he looked in the stone and was deceived, far too often, I guess, since Boromir departed. He was too great to be subdued to the will of the dark power. He saw nonetheless only those things which that power permitted him to see. The knowledge which he obtained was doubtless often of service to him, yet the vision of the great might of Mordor that was shown to him fed the despair of his heart until it overthrew his mind." And that final bit of the sentence is quite important, I think, that it overthrew his mind. Sauron is so powerful that Denethor is no longer acting like himself. And the phrase kept recurring in my brain. I couldn't remember why. And so I realized that in the movie, that is actually the phrase that Gandalf uses to describe Theoden. He says, "Theoden, whose mind is overthrown," just before we are introduced to him in the movie, which reinforces the parallel between these two rulers of kingdoms of men, Denethor on the one side and Theoden in the other. Both are actually being manipulated by powers of evil. Theoden, very visibly, with the presence of Grima Wormtongue, is being manipulated by Saruman and therefore Sauron as well. Whereas Denethor, upon meeting him, he is alone. There is no evil council next to him, but he's actually being influenced by the Palantir and by Sauron himself. Sauron being a far more conniving and powerful enemy than Grima. And it seems that Gandalf doesn't realize his influence and thinks that Denethor's poor judgment is of his own making rather than the corruption of somebody else. So Gandalf is able to rouse Theoden and remove Grima, but he fails to do so with Denethor. One other possible difference for the change from the book to the movie is the possible change in the impact of suicide from writing in the early 20th century to writing in the 2000s. Tolkien says that faith is hope without guarantees, and suicide, as the opposite, is giving into despair, which is the opposite of hope. In Tolkien's Catholic thinking, suicide will also be seen as a great sin because it is sin without any hope of redemption. Any other sin, there is time to redeem yourself. Theoden himself could be seen as at least failing in his duties as a king, but he is able to redeem himself on the battlefield and lead his men in the help of Gondor. But Theoden, because his final act is an act of suicide, there is no time for him to redeem himself. At least in the book, I would argue there's the fact that he sees Faramir at the last moment in the movie maybe is a glimmer of a possible redemption, but not in the book. There's also a different social perception of suicide and mental illness broadly between the early 20th century to the early 21st century, which maybe changes our interpretation of the scene. I'd even say that there's a difference between when the movies came out in the early 2000s compared to now in the early 2020s, where our view of mental illness and suicide has changed a lot in just these last 20 years. So to conclude, Gandalf is an incarnate angel whose mission is to guide humankind and elfkind in the fight against Sauron. Denethor, while very prideful and very selfish, is not the enemy, and I would even argue that his mind is completely overthrown by Sauron, so he is also a victim of the enemy, not just a passive participant in the enemy's works. The movie is more focused on the dramatic action of the scene, less focused on the philosophical and religious debate on hope and despair. The scene would play very differently. It was just two old men talking about hope and despair at each other while guards were surrounding them. So the flames and everything heightens the Hollywood nature of the scene. The possible lesser impact of the taboo of suicide between the 2000s and 1950s could also help to explain some of these changes. And I wonder what y'all think. Do you believe that in the book Gandalf would kill Denethor if the scene had happened the same way as it does in the movie? This is a short work cited. There'll be a bigger bibliography in the published proceedings. And if you have something nice to say, please feel free to reach out to me by email. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Adam, for that. I think inspired a quite spirited conversation in the comments. Obviously, I really appreciated how you contextualized the change in social perception of suicide and mental illness over the past, really past century, and particularly the ways it moved out of a religious framework of sin into a therapeutic, more therapeutic and mental health understanding. So I do really appreciate that. We had a comment that came through in the Q&A, which was Iola says, "Hi, Adam. Just a comment. Documentary filmmaker and anthropologist friend of mine was summoned by Ridley Scott to discuss the culture of pre-contact Amazonians for his film New World. After correcting numerous errors in the script, Scott said to him, 'You have to understand, it makes a better movie to do things my way.' So the visual can and does trump fidelity in films. I see you nodding and smiling if you want to offer any further reflections on that."
Yes, I have great delusions of grandeur that with this PhD, I will be contacted by many a film director on how to properly adapt any work of fantasy. But I'm fairly sure that if ever they did, they would tell me if we did it your way, nobody would ever go see this movie except for the members of our audience today. So yeah, I understand the problem absolutely. I think there is a way still to do things properly like in terms of adaptation or even on terms of respecting indigenous cultures and still make a Hollywood-esque movie. I think quite often the idea that like it's simpler this way is a bit of an easy shortcut. That maybe with a bit of effort, actually, it would be possible to do things the right way. But nobody's asking me so far, so we'll see how it goes.
Sure. If others have questions they would like, please pop those in the Q&A. I was actually curious about something related to your work in adaptation studies, Adam. I was intrigued by this notion of oscillation, the oscillation between source text and adaptation. It reminds me of something the fantasy theorist Michael Saylor says about reading fantasy, in which we oscillate between the primary world of the reader and the secondary world of the book, and or film or whatever the media happens to be. So I would be curious to know more about that oscillation effect, and maybe specific examples related to Jackson's adaptations of Tolkien, or more broadly in terms of the work you're doing.
I'd say even just generally, fantasy, of course, however removed from our reality, is about our reality, right? There is no conceivable uh, any story in a fantasy world is about our real world. I think G.K. Chesterton says something like, "The shape of fantasy is not to say that dragons are real, but that they can be defeated." So the idea that as evil and problems arise, it tells us in the real world that we can actually do something about it. Um, so yeah, I hope that answers the question. Absolutely, there's oscillation always between the secondary world and the primary, as well as between the adapted text and the adaptation.